My name's Robin Harper. I joined the Green Party in 1985 for the Ecology Party in the 1999 election. After 15 years very hard work, I became Britain's first ever elected Green parliamentarian. I beat Caroline Lucas and Jean Lambert by a month. I joined the Scottish Ecology Party in 1985. I can remember the precise date. It was July the 11th, the day that Rainbow Warrior was sunk. I very quickly found myself taking office as the Edinburgh coordinator for the party, and I've always been a convinced European, and I think it must have been 1986 or 7 that I first attended a meeting of the European Greens in Brussels. I do remember that people like Sarah Parkin were there, and my connection with the European movement has continued from then to the present day. Sometimes as a delegate, but sometimes I would pay my own fare in order to attend the conferences, because I just have a very deep interest in the development of the green movement in Europe. But it's this exciting idea of green thinking permeating Europe and going beyond Europe. We now have the World Federation of Green Parties, and one day I hope to go to one of those meetings. A bit of a luxury, but I do hope to attend one of those meetings. Particularly from the point of view of the Scottish Green Party, it's been a history of continuous growth. There were a smattering, whenever of elected representatives at the beginning. We've now got to the stage where we have huge numbers of elected representatives across Europe. We also had, of course, the big development for the European Greens of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the access of parties beyond the old Iron Curtain to European politics. And interestingly, most of the parties that were ready to join were parties that were based on the one area of political expression that was open to people behind the Iron Curtain, which was environmentalism. And so there was, if you like, they had a running start at green politics. It's also the ability, because we have a common agenda, the ability of these parties, for the most part anyway, to work very closely together with a high degree of agreement on what our common aims are, and that's enabled us to progress. There have been, I suppose, old politics, and there's also the politics of there is a clash between localism and the idea that we don't want too many fractions of the movement. I remember when I went to Helsinki in 1992 to the conference there, which took the Greens Federation a step further in the right direction. I wanted Scotland to be represented as an independent party, independent of the English and Welsh Greens and the Northern Ireland Greens, for that matter. And there was a division. There was quite a few people were nervous about it as an idea. Looking at other parts of Europe where they thought that Green parties would split because localism, they saw the Scottish side of things as localism. And of course we didn't have our parliament then, but it was a Labour Party policy. Sadly in 1992 they lost the election and we didn't get a parliament, which actually, it damaged the Scottish Green Party very badly. A lot of people lost heart at that point. They just said, that's it, we're not getting a parliament. What's the point in a Scottish Green Party? Why don't we just work with the English Greens in one? But I'm very proud of the fact that I carried the day, and I did win the vote. It was fairly close. And now we have a parliament, and of course I have every justification for having an independent delegate representing Scottish Greens. Over the next 20 to 30 years, I see the Europeans managing, I think, to cope fairly well with the idea that you can have parties representing different parts of different geographical areas. It's settled down, I think, very well between Scotland and England and Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and I don't think there's any reason why the other parts of Europe where there are, I'd hate to say nationalists, where there are localist groups who would like to shade their responses to green politics in the fashion that they would like to do it, would be given the freedom to do that. And I think what should give people confidence is the huge common agenda that we have that does bind everybody together. There's going to be strength, I think, a great deal of strength in having a lot of opinions. We've just been listening to Danny Cohn-Bendit talking about freedom of expression, and I think that we should be confident enough now to be able to say to ourselves, there will be parties that might disagree with the general run of green thinking. We can cope with that. It's not going to bring the house down. It might strengthen it, because if somebody disagrees with something that everybody else is sort of more or less mucking along with and saying that's all right, it might in fact be the fact that the reason why they're mucking around with it, mucking along together, is that they haven't given it a great deal of thought, that they've just accepted, oh, this is probably a good idea, and gone along with it. So it is very, very important that we should have this diversity of expression across the board. I also see us moving in and out of various kinds of influence and power across Europe in governments, and sometimes having more influence than perhaps our numbers would on the surface appear to justify, just as, for instance, in the last Scottish Parliament, 2 Green members, myself and Patrick Harvey, managed to change things. The Greens might be faced with the possibility of being asked or being offered a coalition agreement by one of the other parties, possibly Labour. In the 2003 election, there was a little move from Labour, a phone call or two suggesting that we might like to talk to them, but sadly my colleagues didn't think that it was going to be a good idea. We would have been a minority coalition, and I suppose the same thinking informed Patrick and myself in the 3rd Scottish Parliament, in that there didn't seem to be any point in having a minority coalition. But we did have a working agreement, and I think that this is what, on the New Zealand model, might be a serious consideration on May the 5th for the Scottish Green Party. And I think that's a model I'm not sure if in other parts of Europe people have thought of doing this. They tend to form coalitions and stick together on a completely common agenda. I think it would be very interesting and possibly useful if we attempted to form the kind of New Zealand model agreement with a party where we would say we'll vote for the budget, but we will vote down or vote against anything that you want to do that we disagree with, and vote for those things in your agenda that we do agree with. 12 years in office have given me, I suppose, cause to look back over those 12 years. I've just published my biography, and there are things that I now wish that I'd put in it in terms of successes. So the big success was obviously getting us elected in the first place. But we did an awful lot more than that, because all the way through all three parliaments, my own experience was that with a bit of assistance from, particularly from environmental organisations, but also sometimes from children's charities and so on, I could go into committees and lodge amendments that actually changed the legislation that was going through the Parliament. And when I look back on it, I think I had really a respectable number of successes where, due to my efforts, legislation on national parks, legislation on the marine environment, land and strategies, all these pieces, and on farming, all these pieces of legislation, in some cases government policy and regulation, were considerably improved as a result of our efforts. It isn't all big picture, but there's a lot of good, solid groundwork that the Greens did and will continue to do in committee. People tend to forget that the Scottish Parliament is unicameral, and so the important work is not done on the floor of the chamber, it's done in the committees, and we've done some really good work in committee.